Cool. All right. Well, thank you for coming. How was last week for both of you? Did you feel like you kind of got it? Did you feel like made sense? Kind of like where you at?
I kind of understand the logics, but just sometimes I just cannot memorize all of the SQL.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I totally get that. What about for you?
I can understand, but sometimes if you ask me to write something, I might not be able to figure out fast.
Yeah, that's definitely the trickier part. It's like kind of the same as learning like another like spoken language, right? It's like it's often easier to like learn like reading and start to be able to understand stuff that way, but it's a lot harder to be able to come up with it yourself. So it's kind of the next level. So cool. Okay. Yeah, I mean I think that's like exactly where I'd expect you to be at after, just one 2 hour session on this sort of stuff so far. So you're all good, you're in the right place. Um Cool. So we'll do a little bit of like review of that, and then we'll kind of go like one layer deeper with it for this. Um, so we'll use the same like hex thing we used last time. You should see one in there that now says fall 2025 week 4, similar to last week. So if you log into like the home page or whatever, you should see it under projects, but if you don't see it here, you can go on the left-hand side to projects and you should see a fall 2025 week 4, and then just make sure you do the ... here and make a copy. I will do that for the purposes of demo. Duplicate. I'll think for a second. Label this Rachel's copy. Cool. All right, so yeah, fall 2025, week 4, make yourself a copy. And while you're doing that, I'll kind of go through what we covered last week and what we're going to cover this week. So last week we talked about kind of what Python can do for data analysis, how to think about when to use it. We started to talk about how to read Python code and understand what it's doing. So it sounds like that maybe starting to get a little bit soaked in. And then we also went to the step of starting to write and edit some simple Python code that you might use for data analysis. So things like manipulating our data frames, doing some basic math or functions, and then how to use functions from a library is kind of what the part we talked about at the end. So we'll kind of revisit all that, make sure that all makes sense, and then we'll go a little bit further. So yeah, we'll talk about navigating data frames, which is the main sort of data structure that we're going to interact with, although there are others you can use in Python. Agent. We're going to look at functions some more. We're going to do some very basic intro on how to write your own functions. We'll kind of take some similar ones and kind of look at their structure. Also talk a little bit about some strategies to use Hex Agent, which is the like AI tool that's built into Hex. So how to use that, how to think about using that as sort of a beginner as you're writing code. And then we'll start applying our functions to our data frames. So we'll get into that at the end. Okay, great. So like I said, make sure you get into your copy of the fall 2025 week 4 thing. And then once you're in here, just make sure you hit run all at the top in pink. That'll make sure everything populates on down. It will show an error for you once it gets all the way to the bottom. That's intentional. There's a cell at the bottom that we're going to fill in together later in the session, which will resolve the error. So don't be concerned if you see a little error thing pop up. We will, yeah, number 20, we will figure that out together. All right. So just some little terminology refresher. Okay, the data frame is where we're accessing our information. So it's got rows, it's got columns. You can picture it as a spreadsheet. This is just one of many types of objects that you can interact with in Python, but it's pretty much the main one we're going to be using for the purposes of this workshop. Function, this is a series of steps that you define. We choose whatever inputs we want, and then it produces some sort of output. So the example we used last week was we were able to produce a visual of a word cloud was the output of one of our functions. So it could be something like that. It could just be more data. Outputs can be all kinds of things, but your function is anything, any sort of steps you define that take some inputs and provide an output. Okay. And then a library, we'll talk more about these today. So a library is a bunch of functions that somebody else already wrote and the general kind of open source community that you can just use. So you got to know a little bit about how to read kind of which parts of the function, what inputs it's asking for. But once you have that figured out, you can just go ahead and use the function. You don't have to write all those steps yourself. All right, so just as a refresher for using hex for today, you can add as many cells as you want in between just with our little plus button and then Python, and that's what we'll be adding today. And we're going to be using the same data sources that we used last week. So I've got our Seinfeld TV series data in there, as well as our data from the 2024 Paris Olympics. So you'll see those data sets for a little refresher. You're in hex on the left-hand side. If you hit data browser at the top with the lightning bolt and then data frames right here, you'll see all of the data sets that we have at our disposal. All right, this is a little refresher from last week. So commonly we are going to need to access one column or one row of our data frame so that we can perform a further function on it. So anytime you're going to be accessing a column of your data set, that's where we're going to use the name of our data frame, our square brackets, our single quotes, and then the name of our column inside of there. So as an example, you can see all of our data frames on the left. So I've left a little code block in here so you can pull out one column or one row of one of these data sets. If we look at our athletes data, for example, this is the data set we were using last week. You'll see a bunch of different column names here, and we can access any of those column names like this. We can do the name of our data frame, which in this case is athletes data. Then to get to a specific column, we do a square bracket, single quote, and then the name of the column. So let's say I want this name TV column. Let's see what's stored in there. I can type this in, hit enter, and hex will give me a little preview of all the data that's stored in that column. I can see these are names. They must be like specifically formatted, or, you know, maybe they're using nicknames or whatever for TV. And it'll give me the first 5 rows. It'll give me a little dot, 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 and then it'll give me the last 5 rows. And then it'll give me a little bit of info about it, specifically how many rows are in this column. So there's about 11,000 rows, a lot of data in here. All right, so go ahead and try that with any of the columns in our data set. And you should also try to pull out one row of our data set. So to access our one row at a time, it's our row locator, which is our .iloc, and then square brackets, and then the number of the row that you want. So row 0 or row 100 or row 1000. All right, so go ahead and try that maybe with our athletes data set. All right, so you'll just pick a column, make sure you can get a column of data returned, and then try grabbing any row, pick your favorite number, and just make sure you can get that to pop up. That'll make sure all your data is loaded and good to go. Thank you for joining us. Remind me if you were here last week?
Not last week, but the week before last.
The one before. Okay, great. So we're in hex. We're using that same tool, so same situation. So if you hop into hex, you're looking for this fall 2025 week 4 workspace, and you just want to hit the ... and make a copy. Right, so ... and then duplicate. You can make your own copy for the session. Give me a shout if you need help with that. Back into my copy for demo purposes. All right, so go ahead and make sure you can get column of your choice, row of your choice. Returned. Row example here. So again, to do my row, I'm going to do name of my data frame, .iloc, square brackets, and then any number I like. Let's do row 2400, for example. I can hit run or I can hit Command Enter on my keyboard. And then this is going to give me, again, a little preview of all of the data here. In this case, there's not a ton of columns, so it's actually going to give me all the columns on the left-hand side and then the values that are in row 2,400 for each of those columns. All right, so this is just returning the 2,400th row of this data set. And a little confusingly in this preview, it's presenting the information to me vertically, but I know it's stored in my data set as like a spreadsheet row. All right, everybody get a column and a row to work, run something like this, get a preview. Okay, fabulous. Cool. All right, if that ever doesn't run for you, like just the common troubleshooting thing is just to run all the data from the top because our top few cells here are loading our data. So I'll come back to this in a second. We'll finally like talk through what this is doing, but these are loading our data frames. So if your data frames don't populate here, then any other code that you write to reference them won't. So just something to know. All right, we talked about data browser. Okay. So another topic we talked about last week was saving information to a data frame. All right, so we have several existing data frames. They have several existing columns, as we've already checked out, for example, with our athletes data frame. Okay, but one of the places we can start to use some analysis is to add new columns to our data set. So to do that, we give the name of our data frame. We do our square brackets, single quotes, same as we would to refer to an existing column. But instead of referring to an existing column, we just make up a new name. All right, so we make up a new name for our column. I could call it something like a new column, Rachel's column, whatever you want. Typically, there's no spaces in these columns, so you want to do like underscores to separate words, something like this. Then you put an equal sign and then whatever function you want to do on the other side of it. All right, so as an example, I'm gonna go ahead and add a cell here. Let's say I wanted to add a column to my athletes data set. So what I would do first, put in my athletes data. This is my data frame. Do my square bracket, single quote, and this is where I'm gonna make up a new column name. All right, in this case, let's see what might be a fun column. Let's do maybe height. That sounds fun. All right, so I'm going to say height times 2 is going to be my new column that I'm going to create. All right, I'm going to do my equal sign, and then on the right side of the equal sign, I'm going to put whatever kind of manipulation I'm doing, whatever, typically this would be a step in your analysis. So in this example here, all I'm doing is adding together 2 columns. So I'm referring to one column, again, my square bracket, single quotes, and then just plus, and then another column. Right, what that's going to do is create a whole another column called a new column. That's the sum of those 2. So another very similar example to that I can do in my athletes data set. I can multiply their height by 2. So how would I do that? On the right hand side of my equal sign, I'm going to refer to my athletes data set again, square bracket, single quote. I'm going to do my height column. It's just called height in all lowercase. And then I'm going to say times 2. All right, so just asterisk 2. All right, and let's give that a chance to run. Okay, great, no errors. That looks great. And then when I come over to my athletes data set over here, I'll notice it went from 36 columns, I'm sorry, to 37. My new column is down here on the bottom, or all the way on the right in my data frame. And in fact, if I want to see my column, I'm just going to add another Python cell here. This out. And we can just paste this into a cell, run this part, and I can see a little preview of my data. Now it looks like several of these people are 0 inches tall or 0 meters tall, however this is being measured. So it looks like there might be some data quality challenges, but I see at least one athlete here is listed as being 330. So what would that be? So like centimeters? I don't know what unit that would be. But they're not actually that tall, right? They're actually, 165, whatever inches, whatever that is, tall. So this is just an example of manipulating our data. So we've added this column, and then we could do further operations, right? We could take an average, we could do more advanced sort of math, statistical analysis, etc. All right. Everybody get do some math, get another column added to your data frame. You'll know it works if it appears in your data browser. Okay, any questions about what we did here? Okay, all right. You gotta let me know if you have questions because there's only 3 of us, so I can definitely answer them. Right? Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit about variables versus functions. All right, so what we just did is we sort of used a very basic version of both of these things. Variables, like that you might remember from back in the day in algebra class, that this is going to allow you to save some information, some results of a calculation, and then you can reuse it later by just referring to that variable name. All right, so that's what we basically did here by adding our column. But what if we want to reuse the calculation itself? All right, what if we're doing a more complicated set of steps than just multiplying something by 2? That's where we're going to use a function. All right, so a function is going to allow us to save that series of steps so that we can just refer to our function name. Okay, so this is an example of a function. Now, we talked about these a little bit last week, but not a ton, and you probably haven't looked at a ton of Python code, so you don't have a ton of idea of what's going on here. That's okay. We're going to kind of talk through what this is doing. Luckily, Python uses a lot of kind of Englishy words, so we can kind of figure out the logic just by reading it. Okay. So first thing to know about a function is it will always start with def, which is for define the function. So def, it's always going to start. Space, and then the name of the function. So this is whatever name you assign. This is a very simple thing called my function. Okay. Then you're going to have some round parentheses, and then inside those parentheses is where you're going to put your inputs. All right. So remember, a function is we're giving some information, we're doing some steps, and we're outputting some other information. You can give it as many different pieces of information as you want. You might give it 1 piece of information, 2 pieces of information. Could be giving it a value or a data frame or a column name. Those are all the types of inputs that you can give your function. You're going to separate them with commas and close your parentheses, do a little colon right here. Okay. All right. So that is the first line of our function. I'm going to skip down to the bottom to the last line of our function here, which is always going to start with return. All right. You're either going to return nothing. That's fine. You might just have the word return and nothing else, or you might have a specific value or something that you're putting out. All right. So in this case, I have some variable called the thing I want to output, and that's what I'm returning. Okay. So I'm defining my function, what's the name of it, and what are my inputs. And then at the end, I'm saying, what do I want to sort of spit out? What do I want to return, give back? Okay. All right. Let's talk about what's going on in the middle of this function. Typically, what you're going to do in the middle of a function is assign some sort of variable. You're going to do some sort of steps, or maybe commonly in data analysis, you're going to do some math with whatever your inputs are. You're going to save that result to your variable, and then that's what your variable is, what you're going to spit out. All right, so what you could imagine is your variable here, which is going to be the thing on the left side of an equal sign. That's how you know it's a variable. In this case, it's the thing I want to output, right? You can think of that as sort of a blank sheet of paper, right? In this case, this equals square brackets. That's just an empty list. Square brackets is how we denote a list in Python. So it's just an empty list, like a blank sheet of paper. And then what we're doing in these other few lines of code is adding stuff to that piece of paper, and then we're going to return all that information, or kind of filled in sheet of paper here. That's sort of the structure that many functions follow. Okay. So what are we doing here? We're doing a little loop. You don't need to worry too much about memorizing what this is doing, but I want you to understand sort of the type of thing that can happen inside a function. Okay. So this is saying for item in input 1. So input 1, we can just check where the same name appears, is one of my inputs that I was provided in my function. So I can assume it's some sort of list. Okay. So for item in input 1, I've got a colon here. So I'm going to indent. This means anything indented is happening inside my little for logic. So I'm going to take the first thing that appears in my input 1, and then I'm going to do a little bit more math. I'm going to assign another variable called new item. I'm going to take that item from my list, so the first thing in my input. I'm going to add input 2 onto it. And then I'm going to append that. So here's my variable name again, the thing I want to output dot append. All right, so adding it to the bottom, my new item. All right. So let's say my input here is the list of all the heights of all the athletes in the Olympics. And my input 2 is the number 10. Okay. Then what this is going to do is for each athlete's height, it's going to take that athlete's height. It's going to add my input 2, the number 10, to that height. It's going to take that height plus 10 number, stick it on the end of my blank sheet of paper. And then it's going to do that again for every athlete. So my paper is going to have a bunch of numbers that are the height of that athlete plus 10. And then once I'm done with all those items, I've gotten to the bottom of my input 1 list. I'm just going to spit out those results as their long list. Okay, so that's sort of a basic example of a function. I would say what you should think about as sort of learning a little bit of Python for analysis is the ability to read a function and sort of manipulate what it's doing. We're not going to be writing a ton of these sort of wholesale from scratch by yourself, but you should try to understand enough about what it's doing that you could sort of manipulate it. Okay, like for example here, let's say we wanted to add some sort of additional value onto this function. So let's say we wanted to have a third input, some other thing that's coming in, and we wanted to add to each person's height not only input 2, but also input 3. Okay, the only changes we would make to this function to do that is we would add a little comma right here and an input 3. And then down here in line 4, we would just add plus input 3. All right, that would be a very simple edit to sort of bring one more piece of information into this function. So that's a type of edit you can sort of think about. All right, so here is an example of using that function. All right, so this is when you call a function, you don't list out all of the steps again, right? So here where we're defining the function, we're listing out all the steps. When you actually use the function, all you're going to do is give it the name of the function, your round parentheses, and then whatever inputs are required. So here I'm giving this function 2 inputs. I'm giving it A, B, C as a list, right? And then I'm giving it the string cats. Okay, that's all I'm doing here. A, B, C, and then cats. So knowing what we know about our function, what is it going to return if we give it our input A, B, C as a list, and then string cats? So let's go back to here. So my function, input 1, input 2. So input 1 is ABC, input 2 is cats. All right, so we're going to create a blank list called the thing I want to output. We're going to grab the first thing in our list, which is the letter A. We're going to attach onto the letter A the string cat. So it's going to say A cats as one string. All right, then we're going to stick that onto our blank sheet of paper. Then we're going to come back again, since we have more items in our list. We're going to grab B, right, which is this next thing in our input 1 is the letter B. Okay. We're going to come here. We're going to add letter B plus the string cat. So it's going to say B cats. All right, we're going to add that onto our sheet of paper. And then we're going to do the same thing for C. All right, so it's going to be the letter C plus the string cats, C cats. We're going to add that onto our piece of paper. And what we're going to get back from that is the list of, did I write it down on here? Is the list A cats, B cats, C cats, all as one list. All right, so that's the output of this function. All right. So the purpose of writing functions, especially functions that are like more useful than this function I've written, which just adds the string cats onto things, is that you can reuse the logic. Okay, so in this case, we had a very simple list of some alphabet letters, and we were adding on a string. But let's say we wanted to add that string onto something in our data frame. Like let's say we wanted to add the word cats to every episode of Seinfeld title. Right, we could do that by taking our function, my function, and instead of giving it that list of letters, we can actually give it a column in our data frame because that's going to function as a list. So this ratings data title, okay, that's the same way I'm accessing any column in my data frame. So we did that just here, right? This is just a reference to a column. So I'm giving this as a list. I'm giving my same input to as cats, and then I'm telling it that it's my function. And this is going to return that same result. So good news, bad news, cats will be the first episode title all the way down. Right? I could also save that to my data frame like I did here, right? With my height times 2 column, where I'm creating some name. On the right-hand side, I'm putting my function call, all right? And then I'm saving it to my data frame. So you can take a look at this. Now, in this case, my function isn't doing anything very advanced. This is actually quite the same as doing something like this. So let's say I have, what column was I looking at before? My name TV. Let's say I wanted to add a string onto here. Something like every athlete's name plus the text is a great athlete. All right, so this is very similar to what I was doing here. All right, and now it's going to return my same little list of names for the sort of TV formatted name, plus this little string that I've added on here. So everything in those quotes is getting added on, and you can see in this preview that now it's just each athlete's name. If I take this part out and just do what I did before, you'll see that part goes away and the name remains the same. All right, and I can save this to my data frame just like we did before. I could have athletes data, square bracket, single quote, come up with a fun name, something like athlete description, and then I'll put my equal sign. Okay, my equal sign is what's going to tell me, is what's going to tell Python, all right, take this thing on the right hand side and save it to the thing on the left hand side. Okay. All right, so if I run that, I'll see I now have 38 columns in my athlete's data frame when I'm looking over here in my data browser. I'll scroll all the way down and I'll see my athlete description appears here. I can refer to this column anytime I want. Cool. All right, and I can actually see here in my row 2,400 that I looked at before, I can actually see it's pulling out the height times 2 and this athlete description I just made. All right. Any questions about sort of the function that we walked through, how that works? Feeling okay so far? All right, cool. Okay. So this is what we talked about last week. This was our one of our examples of a function, was to figure out what words most commonly appear in these athletes' philosophy statements that they have included in this data set. What about the other sort of text columns that we have? So for example, it looks like there's this like reason column. This guy is given a quote about how sport allows him to express himself. All right, it looks like he didn't fill out some of these other ones, but they have the opportunity to list a hero or someone who's influenced them or their philosophy, right? So there's all sorts of sort of text data in this data set, not filled out for every row, but probably has some interesting stuff in there. So what we did last week is we started to pull out what are the most common words, and can we use that to make a word cloud, a visualization of this text data. All right, so this is the code that we wrote last week, or that we looked at briefly last week. On the left-hand side is an example of a chunk of code that we wrote to use once. And on the right-hand side is this same code basically turned into a function that we can reuse. All right, so the thing on the left, thing on the right are basically doing the same thing. But here, now that I've defined these steps, I can reuse this logic anytime by just saying find most common word column and not having to rewrite this whole, what is this, 6 or 7 lines here. I can just do it in that one line. All right, this is a big thing with sort of scripting and using Python for data analysis. You don't want to be copy pasting the same code over and over. You kind of want to write it once, make sure it works, and then refer back to it. All right, saves you from things like typos and all kinds of other errors. All right, cool. So before we get into that, all right. So let's hop over to our hex and head on down a little bit further. Okay, so before we get back into our libraries, I want to talk a little bit about filtering our data sets. So we have talked about how to access individual columns and rows. We've talked about how to do some manipulation. Something we have not talked about specifically is how to sort of select part of our data set or filter our data set by a value. Okay, so this is the type of thing that we might want to do. We might want to filter all of our athletes by folks who are in a particular sport, or folks who are over a certain height, or any number of those types of criteria. All right, so I have an example in here about how we would do that. All right, so when we're applying a filter, we're going to do sort of some logic on the column or columns that we're filtering by. All right, so in this first example that I have here, we're going to try to filter for just the athletes who are involved in rowing. Okay, so what is this line of code doing in this example? In my data browser so we can see it all the way across. I've got an equal sign, which means that the thing on the left side of my equal sign is some sort of like variable or thing I'm newly creating to save the stuff that's on the right. Okay, so I'm creating this new thing called rowers data. And what am I creating it from? So on the right-hand side of our equal sign, we have athletes data, which is our same old data frame that we were using before. I've got my square brackets, which I recognize. And then within my square brackets, I've got this little chunk of logic, right? Over. All right, so I've got athletes data square bracket. I've got a square bracket all the way at the end there before reset index. And then I've got kind of this long chunk inside of my square brackets. What's going on in here? This is doing a little bit of filter logic for me. So this little highlighted part right here, to zoom in on it, has a double equal sign in the middle. Double equal sign is a logic check, which is saying, is it true or false that these two things are equal or not? Okay, so this whole thing is looking for, is the thing on the left-hand side equal to this, sort of true or false? So the double equals is checking for true or false, whereas my single equals is sort of assigning that value to the variable. Does that make sense on sort of the different equal signs? Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to grab specifically our disciplines column, right? This is the same old way we would refer to our disciplines column, and check if it contains the value rowing. Okay. If it contains the value rowing, we're more broadly selecting it from our data frame. So athletes data, brackets, what am I selecting from that data frame? Anything where the discipline is rowing. Okay, that's what I'm doing. Reset index is a thing I'm going to tack on to the end of most of my kind of data frame manipulations. It's just going to make it sit a little bit nicer in my presentation here. Okay, so I'm saving this to a new data frame called rowers data, and then on this line I'm just printing out rowers data so I can see what's actually inside of it. All right, once that is done, I can see that I'm selecting a different set of athletes than when I just selected all my athletes. Right, so when I was up here grabbing all of my athletes by name, where did I put that cell? Maybe I got rid of it. TV names. Okay. So let's go back to that. Let's see, athletes, data, TV. All right, so when I just pull up my whole data frame, I see my first athlete is this guy, Arthur. All right, and then here it looks like now my first athlete is Kenya. All right, so it's a different athlete. So that's how I'm sort of doing a gut check here that my filter is working. The other thing I can do is scroll over to the right-hand side on my thing and see if the little preview of these columns is pulling up their disciplines. Looks like it's not, it's in the little dot, dot, dot area that I'm seeing here. So another way that I can check if my filter is working is I can select just the disciplines column of my rowers data set. I know I can do that because if I go into my data browser up here and I check for my rowers data, I can see that it has all those same columns that my athletes data have, right? I didn't filter out any columns, I only filtered out rows. I can come in here, I can do my rowers data, disciplines, did I spelled that right? And I'll see that all the way down, all 493 things that were selected have the value rowing in this column. That makes sense because that's what I want, right? So this is how I'm validating to myself that this line right here worked correctly. All right. Any questions about the filter that we just did here? Okay, cool. So let's talk about some other stuff you might want to do when you're filtering. So one thing you might want to do is figure out what all your options are to filter by. All right, so for example, you might want to know what are all the possible athletic disciplines that you could filter. We did rowing, we happen to know the name of that one, but what are all the other names? Okay, so this is where we're going to use our .unique. Okay, this is our .unique method. So this is, I'm giving it a column, and then on the end of that column, I'm adding .unique, open round parentheses, close round parentheses. And that's just going to give me a list of all the different unique values in that column in my whole data set. All right, so I know my whole data set has about 11,000 rows. So there's probably a bunch of different values, but there's also probably hundreds of athletes that compete in each sport. I just basically want to know what are sort of all the unique values in here. So I can give any column, I can do my .unique, and then it'll give me a list, typically much shorter, of what those values are if I'm expecting them to be repeated. All right, so I see golf, tennis, sailing, triathlon, right, all the sorts of things I would expect. So this might help me figure out a strategy to filter for other things that I want. So in particular, it looks like there's a few different types of cycling in the Olympics. I don't know if anyone here watches the Olympics, maybe you know this already. There's road cycling, there's BMX free cycling, right? There's like a few different mentions of cycling in here. There's also some cases where it looks like athletes are participating in multiple events, all right? So there's track cycling. There must be someone who's competing in both because here's a value in our list that's sort of both together. So let's say I wanted to filter my list for everyone in the Olympics who's doing some form of cycling. The reason I would do this step is to sort of see what the spelling is, right? I see that this word cycling with a capital C is included in all those descriptions, so I can use that as my kind of filtering word. All right, so this is a different way we can filter. Instead of matching on that exact value, we just want to say, does the disciplines contain the word cycling? For this athlete, is the word cycling anywhere in that disciplines column for this athlete? If so, give me that athlete, okay? So what we're doing here is the same thing. We're giving a new name. In this case, I'm calling this filtered data frame, or DF is a common abbreviation for data frame, okay? I'm doing my equal sign, so I know I'm assigning to that data frame. And then I'm accessing my athlete's data frame, same as I did before. And this whole highlighted part is happening between these square brackets, meaning whatever I'm selecting from my athlete's data set is going to be stuff that's applicable to this criteria. All right. What is this criteria? This criteria is saying, go to the disciplines column. We've got .string.contains. All right. So string is text. So does the text contain? And then the word cycling. All right. So again, this is not something you need to memorize exactly, but as you're looking at code like this, you want to get a sense for what it means, start to be able to understand a little bit about what it's doing. All right, so .string is going to be interacting with text. .contains, pretty straightforward. That's sort of the same way you would refer to that just in English. All right, and then cycling is just the text value cycling. So I'm selecting for a filter data frame, everything from athlete's data frame that meets this criteria of containing the word cycling. All right. And I can see here, again, my first athlete listed here is Sophia. All right, so that's a different athlete than before. So it looks like my filter is probably working. And same deal here, I can do my filtered DF, square bracket, single quotes, disciplines, and just make sure that this is working, make sure that all those disciplines contain cycling. This looks really great, right? I've got a bunch of road cycling, BMX, mountain bike, track, etc. So I'm getting all those values. Yeah.
What does the reset index do?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not super important, so I don't want to like focus on it too much, but let's see. Let me put this back here. Show you. So in your data frame, you can see here on the left-hand side, hex is sort of applying this like 0, 1, 2, 3 numbering of the rows. And then you can see in this column here, I have my first row is 77, my next row is 81, my next row is 116, because I filtered out the first 76 rows by this criteria. So reset index is just making those numbers a little cleaner. If I take it out and I run this here, then I'm not getting my nice row numbering on the left-hand side. Then my numbering is just 77, 81, 116. It's not sort of resetting to count from 0 for my new data frame. So it's not super critical. It's smart to throw on if you're doing any data frame analysis, in part because, do I still have it up here? When we were talking about being able to access a row by its specific row number, this .iloc, this is going to be a lot cleaner for you if you've reset the index so that you know that it's just row 1 in this data frame versus remembering that it was row 81 in the previous data frame before you did your manipulation. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah, not something you need to understand the like deep meaning of, but if these numbers on the side are looking funky, it's probably just because you forgot a reset index. Here. All right. Cool. So we have a couple examples in here of filtering for a value. So what I would like you to do next is to filter the data frame by a different discipline. All right, so here we filtered it for any discipline containing the word cycling. You can go ahead and copy paste this line and just make a little edit. What I want you to do is filter it by any other sport of your choice. So you can look at this list here where we got all our unique values. You can pick one that seems interesting to you. All right, and just see if you can take that line of code and just make the edit so that you're filtering for a different discipline. Could be volleyball, could be canoe, rugby, whatever you want, tennis. But go ahead and do that line with your own filter and make sure that you can get it to work and return a different filtered list. Try that. All right, anybody get a different filter to work? All right.
So the
Yeah.
contains function is case sensitive, is that correct?
Yes, very good. Yes, so if I had done cycling all lowercase, for example, here, I can run this guy again. It's not going to get any rows because even though the word cycling is there, it's got a capital C up here in all my values. So I'll swap this back to capital C and should show up. Yeah. In general, with Python, most things are case sensitive unless you're specifically using a function that's not. So it's a good call out. All right, cool. So if just to demonstrate an example here, if I wanted to take the same sort of logic, but just change the filter, I'm going to start by just copy pasting my same old line down. If I don't want to overwrite my data frame, if I want to just make a new data frame, I got to give it a different name on the left-hand side here. So I might call it filter data frame 2, for example. And then I'm just going to change only one thing on the right-hand side. I'm just going to change my filter logic. So let's say I don't want cycling, but I want all the people who do various forms of swimming. Just going to delete the word cycling, put in swimming. I know from looking up here that it has a capital S, right? So a capital S, make sure I hopefully spelled it correctly. Run that, make sure it works. And if I want to print it out and make sure it looks right, I'm just going to do the data frame name again there. And let's take a look. All right, so good. My first athlete is Maisha, so that's a different name. That's a good sign. And then I can double check that disciplines column just to give this a gut check. Disciplines. Let's see what that looks like. Great, I've got swimming, artistic swimming, marathon swimming, etc. Cool. So this is a great example of, this is a little chunk of code that you don't need to totally memorize all the parts. You don't need to, be able to reproduce it from scratch yourself, but it is helpful to understand enough about it that you can swap, that you can just swap swimming for cycling and get a different result. That's what you want. All right. So that's sort of the kind of thing we're trying to get you to here. Okay. All right, great. So we're gonna sort of toggle back to functions. Now that we've talked a little bit about filtering. So this is the function that we were talking about earlier where I'm adding cats to my ABC list. All right, I think this is what I was looking for earlier on my screen share. So this is what my adding my magic word function is gonna return, right? So I've defined my function there. That's the same one we talked through previously. And then when I call it, I'm just giving my function name, I'm giving my arguments, and then it'll return something like this. Okay. So what we are going to do next is practice editing a function. So we're not going to write a function, we're going to edit one, which means you're going to take your magic word function and copy it down. So you're going to copy paste this whole thing on down, and we're going to make a few edits. Okay, specifically, instead of giving it a word and a list of words, we want to give it a number and a list of numbers. All right, and it's going to multiply. So let's say we give it the numbers 10, 20, 30, and then our magic number is 2. Then our result would be the numbers 20, 40, 60 instead. Okay, so you should copy paste this function. Make sure you edit the name. So give it a different descriptive name that makes sense for what we're doing here. And you're going to keep most of the logic, but what you want to do is just make sure that you're multiplying that each number in the list by our magic number, which is our other input. Okay. So again, you're just copy pasting our magic word function, copy this whole thing on down here, tweak the name a little bit, and then tweak the logic. You can also tweak the variable names. Like you could change magic word to be magic number, so that it sort of makes sense in context. Just tweak it so that instead of returning this list where we've added text together, we've multiplied numbers together. Make sense what we're trying to achieve? Okay. I'll give you a moment to try that. You should start with a copy paste down, change the name, something like multiply magic number, and then make some edits. if and when you think you get your function working, you should be able to call it, meaning you should be able to give its name, a magic number, and then a little list of numbers. So something that looks like this. All right, once you have a working function, you should be able to write in another cell something like this, run it, and get the result that you expect. So get your list of numbers, but multiplied by your magic number. So if you think you've got it maybe partly working, try something like this and see if you get the output that you expect. If you get an error, etc. If you're feeling stuck or you have an error, give me a little wave and I'll come get you unstuck. All right, how are we doing? Anyone have a function they think might be working? Yeah, you think you got one? All right, you want to tell us what yours looks like?
Uh, well, how should I tell?
Yeah. So why don't you like read your? So I've got my block of code here that's def. I called mine multiply magic number. Why don't you like read yours to us?
So mine was def
Mhm.
add magic number, setting column, magic number, comma, and list of num.
All right, magic number, list of num. Okay, so I'm kind of changing my little just input labels here, just changing the little names. Okay.
And I created a list called added numbers.
All right, great. Added numbers. Again, I'm just, all this is a variable name, so I'm just relabeling. Okay.
So from number in list of num,
All right, great. So I'm gonna just make sure I'm copy pasting the same title or the same variable name that's in my inputs, make sure it's spelled exactly the same. Great.
added numbers
Great. So
dot
just
append.
replacing here, dot append. So again, I'm just swapping this one with how I relabeled it. Great.
magic number
Number, same way as I labeled.
numbers number
This number. All right, because that's what I've got here, right? So again, I'm just like swapping my labels.
and return added numbers.
Return added numbers. Great. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this guy, paste this on back, so it's all the same. All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Feeling good? All right, great. All right, and then to call my function, I'm just gonna make sure I have my function name correctly here. So I have magic numbers. Great, so once I have this, I'm gonna run my cell. So anytime you write your code, you're gonna wanna run your cell here, and then it'll automatically run, it should automatically run the next one, there it goes. All right, great. So I see my output here. So when I give it the magic number 24 and then the list 10, 100, 1,000, I'm getting 24 added to each of my values. So I'm getting 34, 124, 1,024. All right. This is totally great. This totally works. Technically, the task was to multiply the numbers. So this is adding them together still, but my only swap I would need to make for that is just change this plus sign here to multiplication sign. That change alone, I'll run that, and then that'll change my output to get everything multiplied. Okay, cool. That was great. That worked great. Good work. Most of what the changes that we just made there were changing our like labels and variables. The only like functional change that we made was changing this plus sign into this multiplication sign. All right, that's the only like sort of substantive change that we made. Everything else was just changing our labels so that they made sense for numbers instead of words. All right, the only like real tweak here is that this is multiplying, whereas this one was doing addition. All right, if you do nothing else except copy our function from before and change it to a multiplication symbol, you have completed the task. It might be nice if this is code you're going to use to go back and make sure your little labels and all your variable names and stuff make sense. That's a good extra touch. But to get the job done, all you need to do is switch this one symbol right here. Does that make sense? Any questions about how we got from up here to this function? Okay, did anybody get any error messages or anything? Zero. Okay, cool. All right, great. So there's sort of like two ways that I think about getting to know functions at sort of this intro level. This is the first one, right? So being able to take an existing function and understand enough about what it's doing to tweak it a little bit, right? That's what we did in this step. The other step is to take a little bit of code that you wrote to do one thing that you want to be able to reuse and turn that chunk of code into a function. All right, so that is what we're going to do next. All right, so if you scroll on down, you're going to scroll on down past this. Is I've set up some stuff to install our library, our word cloud library here. You can skip on past this stuff. It just it's installing in your own workbook. That's why it's here. You should see something like word cloud version 1.9.4. That's just telling you it's installed. All you need to know about this is that last week we talked about this word import means you're importing a library that's giving you all those access to all those other functions that you might want to be able to use. So anytime you see import, you're bringing in a library. You only need to import once in your project. Once it's imported, any cells down below, you can go ahead and use that library. Okay, great. So this is where we're going to talk about turning code into a function. So this is an example from our code from last week. And again, these two chunks of code are doing the same thing, but this one is formed into a function. So let's look at the differences between these two. And the preview is there's not a lot of differences. These lines 4 through 12 here, are basically all the same as what's going on in our function on the right-hand side. All right, we're creating an empty list called all words. We're looping through some chunk of data. We're doing a dot split that's separating the words by the white space that we did last week. And then we're doing that dot append, right, adding them to our piece of paper. We're looping on through. And then we're getting all of those words. We're sort of printing them out using this most common function that we imported from our library. This is the library we talked about last week, this counter collections. So these lines are almost all on the right-hand side, exactly the same. So what we're doing from here is turning this into something we can reuse. So the only lines that don't appear on the right-hand side are our top line where we've imported our library. That happens outside our function. We just do that once, so that doesn't need to go in here. All right, that's already done, so we can skip that. Here is where I was sort of trying this data already, right? The process we went through last week was we tried using the function. It didn't totally work. So we wrote a little bit more code to get it to work how we wanted because the words weren't getting split out, right? So I'm going to skip this line because that was just sort of a figuring it out line. I've got my all words. I've got my for loop. These lines are almost exactly the same. All right, here I was just printing it out, which I don't necessarily need to do inside my function. So I'm going to skip that And then this last line is the thing I want to end up with, or in my function, the thing I want to return. So in my function, this line is exactly the same. It's just in my return line that that's my end product. That's my output. Okay. So the only changes I've made, I've given my function a name. So I've done a def and then I've created a name. And then I've identified what my variable is, what I want to be able to swap out in this chunk of code in the future to replace with something else. In this case, the thing I want to be able to swap out in this chunk of code is that this is a reference to a specific column. So if I want to do this kind of like word, word frequency analysis on a different column, I would just need to swap out this, right? I could make it ratings data subdescription. I could put in my athletes data philosophy, right? Any of the columns that we've looked at, I could put in here. So that's the input to my function. This is the only piece of information that I would need to switch out. So when I'm defining my function, I'm going to give it a variable called column. And then in my for loop is basically the same, but instead of referencing this very specific column, I'm just referencing the name of my input. Okay, I'm just making it slightly general to say whatever column you've given me as input, go look at each thing in that column. Okay, that's the only change that I've made. So I'm not really editing the code here. The only other little tweak I'm making is it's indented, right? So anything that's defined in my function after def is all going to be, it's the tab key, it's all indented after that, all the way down through your return. Okay, so does this sort of make sense how we got from the thing on the left, which is just a chunk of code we ran once, to the thing on the right, which is code we could rerun multiple times? Any questions about the difference between this and on the right? Okay, excellent. So we are going to try that. All right, so the next, if you go down a little bit in your workbook, you have the chunk of code that we wrote last week, which is where we took our words from the philosophy column of our athletes data set. And we figured out which words appeared most frequently, and we created a word cloud from those words. All right, so this chunk of code is doing that. First up here, it's importing a couple things to help us do that visualization. And then it's doing a few steps here. And then it's printing out this word cloud. So your task is to take this chunk of code and turn it into a function, meaning something that starts with DEF for defining your function. You're going to do this step. All right. Now, if I were you, what I would do is I would start by coming up with a function name that makes sense, something like make word cloud, right? Copy pasting all this stuff inside and then figuring out what you need to delete or change. All right. You're not going to need to make that many changes on the inside. You need to start with a def. You need to end with a return. And then your task is to figure out how to take this chunk of code that writes our word cloud. So this thing in here, how do you put that inside a function so that we could call it on some different column name? Okay. So that is your task. So again, I would recommend maybe copy pasting this on down and tweaking. I'm going to leave this up on the slide so you can see an example of going from the chunk of code to the formula or to the function. All right, so that's the step you're going to do. You can test as you go. I put a little test sort of thing down beneath it. So once you get your function working, right now this returns an error because we haven't written the function yet. But once you get it working, you should be able to run this and get a word printed out. Okay. So I'm going to leave this up on the screen. I'm going to give you a couple minutes because this might take a little bit longer to look through. All right. Anticipate you might run into some errors and stuff. So give me a little wave when you get stuck and I'll come help, but I'll give you a few minutes to work on this. how we doing? Need a couple more minutes? Don't like we got it? Yeah?
I wasn't working on X. So, well, I have read these two books,
Uh-huh.
but it still says it's
1.8. Oh, hang on. It should be UV. Yeah, it should be UV. Yeah, exclamation point. There. Yeah, so it should be, UV space. Yep, and the one above it. Ooh, yeah, okay. Now do at the top next to run all your restart it. Yeah, let's take a little longer. Should
but there was an error message.
you can get rid of the Y here. Let's jump down. Let's do a restart.
Yeah, that
Great.
will
Okay, cool. All right, so the word cloud thing was a little funky. Uh, there, we were just fixing you all might be having. So just want to make sure it gets fixed. All right, so you should have right here. Okay, so you should make sure it says 1.9 right here. If it does not, or you're getting an error, it's like you're not getting the word clouds down here. I will demonstrate how to fix it. Are either of you having, like, is the word cloud showing up for you at the bottom? Like, do you get this?
Still,
No, that's okay. If you're still working, but this one should have been here before you even started working on it.
oh,
Was-
yeah, it's-
That one's there? Okay, same for you? That was there? Okay, cool. Sorry about the version thing. I don't know what was going on there. Okay. How are we feeling on going from code to function? Feeling stuck? Feeling like you're making progress? How are we doing? Okay, are you feeling stuck? Okay, well, here, let me just see what you got so far. Okay, cool. Yeah, so basically all you need to do is think about where like these are variables that you've set, right? So those are like the inputs that you're gonna give. But in your line here, you're still referring to that specific column and that specific data frame that we gave earlier. Right, so you're not like substituting those in anywhere. So you need to think about where you want to substitute those variables in, if that makes sense. So where would you want to put a different data frame name? Where would you want to put a different column name? You want to put those inside instead of those specific references. So just like we did here, right, where we said for a thing in the ratings data title column specifically, we swap that out for just this little variable called column, which we're going to give each time we call our function. That's from right here, right? So that's the kind of swap you want to be thinking about. Start looking at this together a little bit. Okay, so what I'm gonna do first is just write out my very first line, my definition, all right? So my DEF space and then the name of my function. I'm gonna call this plot a column. And I'm gonna give it 2 arguments, 2 inputs, all right? That's the data frame name and the column name. All right, so I'm gonna say something like data frame name, column. All right, those are gonna be my 2 variables that or my 2 inputs that I'm gonna put into my function. And then I'm gonna wanna return something, I don't know what yet, but this is sort of my basic structure for my function, okay? Now, as far as what to put in the middle of my function, I'm just gonna go copy paste that whole chunk of code we were working with before. I'm just gonna copy paste it all in there and then edit from there, okay? The thing to remember is that everything needs to be indented. All right, so when I paste it in, it's not going to indent, but I just need to select it all, hit tab, that'll indent it all over. Okay, so this is sort of my starting point. So let's figure out what modifications we need to make. First thing is these imports, where I'm importing my libraries. Imports we only need to do once, they don't need to happen inside a function. So the fact that I've done them up here means they're good for all the rest of the cells that I'm making, so I can go ahead and delete those lines out of here. All right, we'll go ahead and knock those out. All right, the next thing I need to do is I need to figure out where where do I want my inputs to go? Meaning, where am I in my code? Am I referring to something specific that I want to be able to swap out with my inputs? So in this line here, number 6, I'm referring specifically to the philosophy column of my athlete's data frame, right? But when I call this function every time, I don't want it every time to go find that athlete's philosophy column. I want it to go grab the column name that I specified in the data frame that I specified, right? I want to be able to reuse this. So I'm going to swap these. So instead of athlete's data, I'm just going to copy paste. I'm going to copy my input name where I want it to be the data frame. And I'm just going to paste that right over my athlete's data. So I'm just replacing that specific reference with whatever I'm going to input from my function. Okay, so meaning when I call plot a column, so for example, down here, when I call plot a column, I can give it the athlete's data frame or the volleyball data frame or whatever I want, and it'll sub that into right here where I've put data frame name. All right, that's the substitution it's going to do for me. All right. Second thing I'm going to do is I need to replace my column name. So whatever data frame I'm using probably doesn't have a column labeled philosophy, right? So I don't want to leave this here, go find the column philosophy in whatever data frame, because it probably doesn't have a column of that name. I want to give it a specific name, and that's this variable right here. So same thing, my column name is that other variable I want to give. So I'm just going to delete the specific reference to philosophy, all right, and paste in my other input. All right, so I'm just making this little swap. So now I'm going to go grab whatever column name from that data frame name, and that's going to function the same way as my specific reference. All right, let's look at the rest of my code. This is all just doing the same steps. It's doing the same logic. That's all fine. I don't need to change any logic. I just want to change my references. If I look here on line 9, I see here is where I'm actually referring to my specific data frame and column name again. And so I just want to make that same substitution. All right, so I'm going to take my same data frame name, column name, and just paste that right on over this guy. All right, so again, I'm just replacing my specific references with my new inputs so that I can sub them. All right, so now that I have this function, when I call it with that same athlete's data philosophy, it should make basically the same word cloud for me as up here where I didn't have the code in a function. Right now that I put the code into a function, but if I call it for that same thing, it should return the same sort of thing. I need to run my function. Okay, great. Here we go. I think it's not exactly the same, but a very similar word frame that got generated just from this one line of code instead of from these, 12 lines of code or whatever I have here. Right, so all I've changed in my function is those specific references from my data frame name and my column name. I've just used those as my 2 inputs, and then I've swapped them out for my specific references to athletes data and to philosophy as the column name. All right, that's all I changed. I didn't mess with any of these functions. I don't need to worry about what plt.figure means. I don't need to worry about any of that stuff. All I need to do is just look for my specific references and be able to swap them. Okay, so this is the kind of like level of like sort of comprehension of the code that you want to be aiming for, right? Not that you understand every little thing, but you sort of can see where your specific pieces are. All right, so now that I have this function, I can run it on anything that I want. All right, so I can go look at my other column options. Let's see, it's data, and see, it looks like there's a bunch of these other text fields, hobby, occupation, reason, all these other things. So I can run my function just by calling its name, whatever data frame, in this case, athletes data, and then any of those other columns. Let's try hobbies. Let's see if, I don't know how good the data quality is in that column, but let's see what words we get out of that. Okay, great. Now in this one line of code, I can see that a bunch of these athletes like to, do photography and go to the cinema. Awesome. That's cool. This is a cool little bit of code that I can do. Looks like a bunch of them have a dog. Awesome. We love that. I could try what's in their influences. So I'm just going to add another cell. And again, just refer to my same function. So plot a column. I'll give it the same data frame again. And let's see what their influences are, whatever that means. Let's see what they've filled out in this one. Parent, father, coach, family, right? That totally makes sense as the most common words. Looks like it's mostly father and not mother, which is interesting. All right, so this function is doing as I want with whatever I'm putting in. So that little change I made is just allowing me to substitute. For example, here, I want to grab my influence column. So in my function, I'm putting that here as my column name, and then my function is doing the work of popping that down to wherever I need to refer to it. Okay. And this is cool because we can do this on any of our other data frames. All right, so in my ratings data, for example, which is my data set of my Seinfeld episodes, I can use this function on that data frame as well because I've made it general. So I can do plot a column. I can give it my ratings data frame, and maybe I want to give it my column title. All right. Let's see what comes up here. All right, Jerry, one of the most common words. That totally makes sense. That tracks. I could try my description column if I wanted. Maybe that. I don't know if that'll be more or less interesting. Let's take a look. Cool, got a lot of character names. That totally makes sense. Girlfriend, decide, apartment, right? Those are all words that make sense for the context. Okay, so the reason we went through this exercise is it's quite common as you're analyzing data, as you're working on a problem, to work something out like on the left-hand side, right? You're just trying to get it to work. You're trying to like spit out a few lines of code. You kind of get what you need to get done. Done, awesome. Sometimes you can just stop there. Frequently, though, you might want to do that again with data from the previous month or the following year, or some other piece of text, right? Like we just did. That's the case where you want to do this step of changing it to a function. And then you can we could sit here all day and like make word clouds of any data that we want, right? Could be fun. All right. Cool. So hopefully you're starting to get a little bit of a feel for turning chunks of code into a function. I want to take a brief aside and talk a little bit about using sort of the like AI assist either in this tool or in other tools. So it's built into Hex. When they originally released it, it was called Hex Magic, which I thought was really fun. They've now labeled it as Agent in here, like everything else. If you hit Agent, you can give it a little bit of a prompt to produce either some SQL or some Python for you. So I want to walk through a little bit of like how to do that and sort of where that sort of intersects with everything we've been learning so far. All right. These slides will get posted afterwards. I have a little thing here that I would recommend that you read. If you're interested in learning data stuff like this, I think this is really important to be aware of. The AI assistants are really good at things like sort of beginner programming exercises. And the places where they tend to fail are later down the line, sort of in real world projects, that's where they tend to make mistakes. And so the problem with this is if you rely on the sort of AI assist for example, all the exercises we just did, which the AI could have cranked out in a second, maybe some of you did, I don't know. That's totally fine, but you won't have that context for when you actually run something like this on a much larger data set. You won't be able to go through and validate what it's done because you need to be able to understand what it's doing and catch sort of more subtle kinds of errors. Okay, so I want to walk you through an example. I gave the Hex agent the same prompt I gave you all, which was write a Python function to find the most common word in a data frame. All right, and it spit out this function. All right, so we know from looking at from our initial Python knowledge that this is a function because it starts with def and it ends with return, right? And it takes in a data frame and a column. All right, so I have sort of a general idea of what this is doing without sort of going to understand all the middle. So this is the function that it wrote. So I tried out that function, I tried running it, and this was the result. It gave me the single word A when I said find the most common words in those Seinfeld episode descriptions. So looks very similar to the one I wrote that I demoed last week in class. But it's doing the classic sort of AI sort of computer thing where it's quite literal. It's literally only giving me the first word, and I sort of want to find the most common several words to make my word cloud, right? So I don't actually really care that it's this word. I want to be able to rewrite it. The other thing that it did here is I had already written a function called find most common word myself. I had tried this myself, and then I decided to try the AI. It didn't recognize that, so by naming its function the same name, it actually overwrote my function. Right? So my function is no longer, unless I go back and change it to have a different name. So that's kind of a subtle mistake that's like a little bit hard to catch unless you know what's going on with the functions, okay? So I made a couple tweaks. I went back and renamed that function, and then I went through kind of line by line to see what it was doing. There's a couple options here. You can ask it to explain what it's written to you. So that the tools are improving at that, right? So I gave you the function and you can sort of ask it like, okay, explain what each line of this function is doing and read that, make sure that makes sense to you. You can also just go and like search the individual functions and make sure that those make sense to you. The other thing you can do is just run it line by line, right? So this function that it gave me like 3 lines of code in here. I could just copy paste this first line out, put in my data frame and column and run that and see if that result makes sense as an intermediate step. Paste in the second line, run it, see if that makes sense, etc. Right? So these are sort of things you can do if you get some code either from an AI assistant or you Googled and found it on Stack Overflow or whatever. You can run the little bits of it and look at the output with your own eyeballs and see if it makes sense to you. Okay. All right, here's another example of a prompt that I gave it. All right. I said, use Python to create a word cloud of these description words. So I saved the results of that thing to a data frame, and I said, use Python to make a word cloud. That's what we just have done. And this is what it returned. It returned a chunk of Python that returned an error. Okay, this is like pretty common in my like testing of these agents. It's not uncommon for them to return an error. So you still need to be able to know how to look at these errors, figure them out. So let's take a look at what this is doing. The error in Python is down at the bottom. Type error sequence, blah, blah, blah. We can ignore that. Expected string instance tuple found. Okay, so this is another use case. Debugging error messages is one of my favorite use cases for AI. So you can paste in the error message and ask what it means. In this case, it's a pretty straightforward one. Expected string instance. That means it expected text, but it got something that wasn't just text, right? That's why it's struggling. So it looks like it's just referring to sort of the wrong chunk of text. Okay. So what it's doing here is it's trying to take in my whole data frame that I saved as description words, which is a data frame that has each word and the count of it, right? It's trying to take that all in as individual words. That's not helpful to me because that's not quite what I want it to do. So I had to make a little switch. I had written another chunk of code. This is sort of that same little tidbit from our previous function where I'm splitting out all those words into just a list. So not a data frame, they're just in a list. that's what I want it to give. So I took the code that it spit out and I just switched this one little reference right here. I switched it to what I knew was the list of just my strings instead of that little data frame. And boom, that returned my same word cloud. So I think in general, like completely fine to use the agent thing, use it alongside what you're doing. I think the key points for you are make sure you can read what it's output and understand enough what it's doing. You can ask it to explain itself. You can run the lines yourself, right? If it gets an error message, you can read the error message and kind of try to figure it out from there. Again, it can help you with the error message. I think the biggest thing is running it one individual piece at a time is kind of the most foolproof tactic. This works for Excel formulas. This works for SQL queries. This works for Python. It's a really good troubleshooting strategy to get things to work. So all that is to say, even with the AI assist, you still need to be able sometimes to go in and make sure it's referring to the right things or making little tweaks. So understanding conceptually what you're doing, what pieces of data you're trying to manipulate, what inputs you're providing, what outputs you want is super, super important and much more important than remembering specifically which square brackets you need where. The AI is really good at remembering that stuff. It's not as good at like actually referencing the right data source for the question that you're asking, right? That's the part it's not as good at, but that humans are really good at with some practice. Okay. Cool. All right, we are running a little bit short on time, but I have two more little activities in here for you, which I think I'll leave for you to test out as you want, but I'll just sort of walk through them. These would be good. These are sort of built exactly on what we just did. So if you want to like really burn this into your brain, there's a couple of pieces here. So one is going back to our filtering our data sets. All right, being able to filter your athletes data and then run your function on that filtered data set. All right, meaning anytime I've done my filtering here, I can give that as an input to the function that we just wrote. So I can make a word cloud, say, of just those philosophy statements of the Irish athletes, for example, or the Indian athletes or whoever. Okay. Next step from that is to then adjust your function, make another. So our previous function was plot a column. The next function you could write, sort of copy and tweak a little bit, is to plot a column and filter it. All right, meaning you can give it a couple more arguments. We want the philosophy column from our athletes data frame, but we want to filter it by the column country for the value equals Ireland, right? Can you put all those things into your function arguments, tweak your function a little bit so it does the filtering for you, right? Make that same swap that we made before, where we're swapping in our values for our specific values for our input labels, right? Our function inputs. And make this function plot column filter. All right, this is again another example of like a little tweak on the function that we already have that already works. All right, there's another one in here. I think this is the last one. It's kind of fun. See if we can go down here. This is an example of a little tiny simple function that's using if logic. All right, what this one is doing is it's taking a numerical rating and it's going to return an emoji based on that numerical rating. So it's checking if the rating is greater than 9, it's going to return the star emoji. If it's not greater than 9, it goes down and checks the next if. So if it's less than 9 but still greater than 7.5, it's going to return green. And then otherwise it's going to return red. All right, I think it's very fun that functions can return emojis. All right, so I thought this was a fun function. So we can do a couple of things. We can apply this function to our data set, right? The same way we were applying, multiply by 10 or multiply by magic number. We can apply this function to one of our columns. And the other exercise I have for you here is to come up with an emoji for each medal description. All right, so in our medalist data set that we worked with last week, there's a column for whether it's a gold medal, silver medal, bronze. You can copy paste this function and make a very similar one that checks if it's gold, return, the sparkle emoji or the gold medal emoji or whatever. So you can make some tweaks to this function and apply it to your data frame. That could be a fun factor in a future visualization that you want to make, for example. Okay, so we don't have time to go through all these, but these are a few more examples. They're in your little hex doc here, so you should have all the info that you need to try those. So yeah, okay. We covered a lot. Today. We talked about this a little bit, but in general, you're only going to be getting to Python in your tool set if you've sort of run out of things that you can do in Excel, run out of what you can accomplish in SQL. For example, in SQL, there's no way that I know of to make a word cloud, right? So maybe you've done some analysis, maybe you've like done all the numerical mathematical stuff in SQL, but you wanted to add some sort of more interesting creative visualization. That's an example of a step where you might want to go to Python, right? Next week, what we're going to do is really start to put together everything we've talked about over the last few weeks. And using Hex, we're going to be able to switch back and forth between SQL and Python and creating some visualizations, which is going to be really fun. So we'll be able to do what I think is stuff that's a little more straightforward to do in SQL. If you were here for the SQL workshops, maybe you agree, maybe you don't. I don't know. You can tell me afterwards. But there's a lot of kind of basic manipulation that I think is quite straightforward in SQL. So you can do those steps there. And then if you want to kind of add some pizzazz, add some like additional layers, you can switch to Python in your very next cell and throw in something fun, like a word cloud. All right, so next week we'll kind of do a project where we put this all together and kind of give you a little portfolio project. That is here next week, same time, same place. Yeah, that's all I got. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. And hope to see you next week.